Today's video is the last of the series looking at how art manifests across the globe from its inception to the current day. Just as we began with a single nation turned empire in Egypt, today's lecture will focus on the impact of Greece as an ancient collection of city-states, empire, and across the multiple resurgences of Greek-inspired thought that largely shape the world we operate in today. As we continue to keep in mind the limitations of time and nuance when addressing vast cultures over hundreds or thousands of years, we come along the first concession we must make in the word Greece itself. Calling the individual city-states of that region that name is in itself an inaccuracy of sorts. A citizen would rather think of themselves as a Spartan or Athenian before even considering themselves to be quote-unquote Greek as a cultural or ethnic designator. The other thing to keep in mind is that this collection of city-states and the eventual empire that gathered under the campaign of the Macedonian conqueror Alexander the Great underwent many distinct evolutions over the course of time, and what we call quote-unquote Greek art in casual conversation most often reflects the aesthetics, characters, and beliefs established in the classical era, a period which represented a high mark in the quest for the understandings of the workings of the universe through psychology, astronomy, theater, architecture, poetry, ethics, mathematics, and other approaches that prioritized a mindset of rationality and order. As we have seen time and time again, Greek art reflects a manifestation of the culture that produces it. It is a visual communication of philosophical stances. Here, especially, we find artists engaged in the search for rationality, order, and the role that humanity is meant to play in the universe. For comparison, in Egypt, you see the stylization of figures as representations of their roles, the prioritization of a ruler who is believed to be a god. In Greece, this means art addresses the nature of humanity. What does it mean to be human is the all-consuming question. This human-centered drive is imprinted in Greek religion. The gods are very human, they are fallible, they interact and interchange with humans, which is different from a lot of other cultures. Egyptian gods don't mingle with humans in this way, neither do Hindu gods. And Buddha is not a god, but a prophet, and he is definitely not concerned with what it means to be human, but how can you leave the human state behind and transcend to a higher spiritual level? This focus on humanity also shows up in the system of rule that we most associate with ancient Greece, democracy, the rule of the demos, or the people. Although this was not practiced in most of the city-states that made up ancient Greece, Sparta, for example, was a military monarchy, and even the democratic rule practiced in Athens was very limited compared to today. This proto-democracy is one of the largest, most successful, and earliest examples of the general populace acting as a governing force. So this focus on humanity and the importance of the human figure and what it means to be human or to have a human experience is an obsession, especially as the culture of Greece develops into the classical age. We can track these trends in their early stages in the archaic period that leads up to classicism. The nature of humanity is so important, sculptors were striving to depict the human form, not merely with greater accuracy, but in a style that communicates a philosophical idea. Here we first see humanism paired with rationality, the desire to find order in the natural world. Philosophers and scientific thinkers of the day were questioning the nature of reality, looking for consistency and trends they could use to explain what is going on in the universe, how it works, and why. As these people try to scrutinize and categorize the world around them, they begin to notice patterns and systems and structures that drew order and beauty out of chaos. This was the root of the philosophy of aesthetics, that cool, detached observation of attractiveness that philosophers would develop into a method of art critique that we will be exploring when we address the question, what is art? Coupled with the desire to portray humans accurately, Greek artists also recognized patterns that cropped up to make a figure ideal or fit with mathematical standards and ratios. This included symmetry along an axis and a mathematical ratio of proportions. Both symmetry and proportions are principles of designs or the ability of an artist to arrange the elements in a way that conveys a message. So the artist here has taken the element of forms and arranged them so that there is volume on one side that matches the volume on the other. This is the arrangement of the element of forms according to the principle of balance. And the combination of accuracy with modifications to fit mathematical guidelines results in a style that we today call realistic idealism. In these statues from the archaic period, there is a struggle to marry the ideal with the realistic. These figures are kind of stiff. It reminds us of the figures that we see in Egypt, where the priority is stability and the representation of the pharaoh rather than who the pharaoh is. As the classical period develops, the more naturalistic style that we associate with ancient Greece was beginning to fully emerge. While these figures still represent the ideals of society, the proportions and muscle mass of a super buff Grecian warrior, there is still a sense of them being uniquely individual and inhabiting the real world. The details of these bodies are intended to invoke humanity down to the smallest detail, to uplift humans as the quote-unquote measure of all things, the pinnacle achievement of the world. And the faces, they are weathered, they show emotion, they give indications of the character of the individual figures. These particular statues were lost in a shipwreck and unknown until the 1970s, where they were discovered off the coast of Italy. And to this day, they are one of the most accurate, large examples that we have of ancient, original Greek sculpture. The fact is, most original classical Greek sculpture and even a lot of the architecture has not survived to the present day due to weathering and theft. The reason why we know what any of these look like is because the originals were so heavily copied in subsequent revival periods. In classical sculptures, naturalism leads to the contrapposto stance, a relaxed, asymmetrical balance of the figure. Aphrodite here appears to be shifting her weight to one foot, relaxing one leg while bending the other. Her shoulders are slightly uneven, her spine is making an S-curve. It's not the stiff straightforwardness of those early chorus sculptures, and it feels like how Aphrodite would stand if she were caught in real-life actions. In this case, disrobing so she can bathe. It's also a good time to point out that the quest for naturalism and expression in art was not limited to just forms in Greek art. Due to outdoor exposure for millennia, not only were many statues lost, but the outdoor layers of sculptures and buildings have been eroded. It is, however, worth noting that color was a major player in Greek and subsequent Roman art. The conception of Greeks in only white togas serenely walking around in white temples is a misunderstanding. The ancient Greek world was likely a riot of color. Thinking about this in light of our recent lesson on color, how does the introduction of this one element of art, color, change your perception of these objects and the culture that created them? Rationality was not just applied to sculpture, but also to architecture. When we look at Greek architecture, we need to remember ancient Greeks' obsession with finding order and noticing patterns in the world around them. Greek culture was heavily investigated in mathematics and ratios or relationships between numbers. Harmony or unity in art or architecture is where all the parts and pieces relate to and complement one another. Golden ratios, mathematical divisions, and geometric shapes show up time and time again. Although the Greek temple is likely the first thought that comes to mind with Greek architecture, there are many different styles of buildings and public spaces, and each different shape is designed specifically for a particular activity, from entertainment to athletics to civic functions. Many of these designs and their respective names, like stadiums or theaters, continue to be used for public buildings to this day. The main reason we are spending so much time on Greek culture is because American society is directly modeled off of it. The Rome-based High Renaissance, which marked the inception of the dominance of European art that carried through the 19th century, was directly lifted from classical Greece. The neoclassical era, which was responsible for the mindset that gave birth to the United States, was modeled on Greek philosophical thought. And because our government system is based on democracy, our buildings reflect that depth in style. What we call ancient Greece dissolved millennia ago, though its ideals remained popular and experienced several revivals, starting as early as copies by artists in the early Roman Empire. Roman religion blended Greek gods with their own pantheon, and architects paid tribute to Greek temples with the use of columns, combining their own innovations like the dome and later the arch. Arches allowed Romans to increase the size and lightness of their architecture, paving the way for a new wave of larger, more airy constructions in the next several millennia. In the Italian Renaissance, the scientific, religious, and philosophical advances of the time are reflected in the arts. See how Da Vinci in his Vitruvian Man is clearly blending ratios and mathematical proportions in an application to an idealized form. The celebration of Greek thought manifests in this fresco Raphael painted in the Vatican, the epicenter of European power, both in the content, in this case a memorial to Greek philosophers and the ideas that they contributed, and in form. Look at the rational spacing and the balance of the fresco, the use of linear perspective, itself a mathematical idealism, the naturalism of the idealized contrapposto bodies, even that super old Plato that is in the center of this fresco somehow magically possesses an idealized buff body. Sculpture, too, was inspired by Greek sources. Michelangelo constantly strived for the depiction of the ideal male form. Let's take a moment to examine one of his most famous sculptures, the David, and to do a comparison of the heavily Greek-inspired art of the Renaissance to the more emotionally driven work of the later Baroque era. First, let's identify what is the naturalistic pose taken from classical Greek that we see Michelangelo's David taking here. And then second, when comparing the two works that are the same subject matter, this is David from the Bible preparing to slay the giant Goliath, and it's the same material. So these are both sculptures carved, and it's the same material. So these are both sculptures carved from marble. How are these two artists using the elements and principles of art to communicate two very different sets of priorities? Once you've answered, let's take a moment to break this down. Michelangelo's David stands straight and tall. His upright position conveys authority. His body is ideally proportioned. He is a man who has been blessed and shown favor. Though there is tension in his body, notice the veins in his throwing arm are bulging, his brow is furrowed, but this David remains calm. He is a man of thought, a leader who contemplates before he acts. Very Greek in his inspiration. Bernini's David portrays the story perhaps only a few seconds later from Michelangelo, but the differences are vast. This David's body is twisted and angled. There is a dynamic pose going on, a pose of action. This David grits his teeth as he focuses all his energy on his sling-swinging arm. His emotions are extreme and clearly evident. Bernini gives us a David as a man of action, a great warrior whose energy and action are divine evidence of the power of God. Now, as we lay the scene for the final evolution of Greek art and ideals, I want you to consider this. Think of any well-known U.S. government building. What are some of the distinguishing features that let you know that it's associated with the government? And why do you think that this building has these features? We'll be looking at the language of American Renaissance architecture momentarily, but let's start by setting the scene in the neoclassical era. Trends come and go, and the rationalism of Michelangelo will give way to a heightened desire for emotionality in art like you see with Bernini. But Greek values and visuals found a new voice in the neoclassical style that became popular during the Age of Enlightenment. In coffeehouses and salons, people came together to discuss radical political ideas, share scientific discoveries, and create propaganda for a new wave of thought. This Greek revival inspired philosophers like Kant in his theories of aesthetics and the arts. In salons in particular, wealthy women were allowed a socially acceptable, influential role in society in a way that had previously been impossible in the restrictive structure of the court of the Ancien Regime. Ladies of means would host gatherings in their estate salon or parlor for the great minds of the day to gather. In exchange for their financial support and supplying a meeting place, these women had the opportunity to act as hosts, meaning they could direct conversations, make connections amongst people, and be allowed to give input and unprecedented access to the minds of those who were shaping the developing world. The neoclassical period once again embraced rationality, order, and reason, and above all, what it means to be human and the rights that each person should have. This is highly focused on the philosophy and arts of Greece. In fashion, you see Greek robes and draping as signifiers of a crowd who are harbingers of a new, more rational era. Artworks were heavily politicized, especially in France, as the scene became increasingly more tumultuous in the aftermath of the French Revolution. Artists took to painting and sculpture as useful propaganda. Using chiaroscuro techniques of lighting and staging of the body of Marat as a martyr, the painter David became one of the most important political voices in his day, creating narratives designed to stir people to action. Even Napoleon used classical language in his propaganda. In this portrait of his coronation ceremony, again by David, look at the dress of the court, especially the gown of Josephine, his wife. The last female counterpart to the ruler of France wore panniers, exaggerated petticoat bumpers of the sort that were exaggerations of the hips. Panniers and corsets made the female figure highly idealized, but also impractical or not useful for everyday life. A perfect example of the criticism that was levied at the King and Queen of France and their court's lifestyle. This costume on Josephine, while still very extravagant, reflects a much more rational approach to life. Note also, in terms of propaganda, that though this is the official court portrait of the ceremonies for Napoleon's coronation or crowning, Napoleon himself in this portrait has already been coronated. The choice was made, like what time period to depict the sculpture of David in, to depict Napoleon in this painting already in a position of power. In this painting, Napoleon doesn't receive power from a higher source. He is already the highest source of power. Instead, he is using his already installed powers to communicate an act of bestowing position to another person, while everyone else, even the leaders of the church, look on. This deliberate choice of what moment to show is a wonderful example of propaganda in action, communicating that Napoleon is a figure not to be questioned on any level by any person in the entire world. Political figures enjoyed posing themselves as ancient figures, choosing to align themselves with the qualities of those that they imitated. Pauline Bonaparte, Napoleon's own sister, was originally slated to pose as the chaste goddess Artemis or Diana, a protector of maidens, a choice made for her by her brother as it was considered to be more aligned with moral tastes of the time. Pauline, however, was not interested in posing as a perpetual virgin, and she instead insisted on posing as Aphrodite or Venus, enjoying the scandal of posing nude under the guise of a historic figure, while at the same time cementing her reputation as a flirtatious and sexually scandalous figure. But perhaps the biggest impact we see today of the neoclassical philosophy and artistic model is in the American Renaissance. Birthed in the neoclassical era, especially indebted to the work of Thomas Jefferson, the American Renaissance is an outward expression of the ideals of the American founders. Jefferson in particular felt a new system of government and re-examining of the rights of man deserved a new art form. Gone are the fripperies and excesses of kings and courts. Architecture and art is a reflection of rationality, of democracy. And what better way to express that than to revisit the art of the people who birthed that idea, the Greeks. The American Renaissance, which spanned the 19th century, was itself a reiteration of that Greek architecture and sculpture. The columns, domes, and draped figures all have roots in antiquity, helping the nascent city to feel older than it actually is. And their connections to systems of power and roots in stability, balance, and mathematics give the structures an air of authority. And most importantly, these buildings and sculptures that adorn them reference the democratic heritage of the American government system. By constructing their offices of state in the Greek Revival style, whose political system and philosophical mindset birthed our country and shaped the platform for how we operate, The architects of these buildings pay visual homage to a conceptual ideal.